it's all pretend. The smiles, the lies, the perfect end. The world's a stage, they run the flow. You clap on cue down in the front row. A final shade.
Good evening. Here we go. Imagine waking, sorry, I'm already screwing the words up. First thing, awesome, right? Let's start over. Here we go. Imagine waking up one morning with your opinions intact, your beliefs, your politics, your disagreements, and going to sleep that very night in a locked room, with a diagnosis instead of a criminal charge and no trial date on the calendar. Also, no jury, no appeal, just a doctor's signature on a door that only opens from the outside. So that is not purely hypothetical. It has happened in countries we call enemies and in countries we call allies. It happened in eras we call enlightened, and the mechanism wasn't always a dungeon or a firing squad. It was sometimes medicine. Specifically, psychiatric institutions and the power to define and confine the word insanity, right? So there we go again. Let's take a break here from the introduction. So there we go again. We've talked about this multiple times. The definition of a word is very, very important, okay? And how we define those words gives certain people more power, less power, different power, okay? And in this case, it gave people power to confine insanity, whatever that meant, okay? So today on Breaking the System, we're stepping through those doors. We'll examine how institutions built, at least in stated purpose, to treat mental suffering in certain hands and at certain times, instruments of control. We'll look at who got locked up and who held the keys, the structural vulnerabilities, and the reforms that followed. Mental illness is real. Suffering is real. But so are the risks when diagnosis meets confinement without strong checks. So I'm your host. This is Breaking the System. Let's get into it. Episode 54, The Locked Ward, Insane Asylums and the Power to Disappear Dissent. Oh, it's awesome, right? Here we go. Let's jump into some historical foundations. So to understand the story, start with the gap between intention and what we call scaled reality. Okay? Before the late 18th century, responses to severe mental illness were inconsistent. Families cared for many at home. Others ended up in workhouses, jails, or places like Bethlehem Royal Hospital in London, known as Bedlam, where some patients were displayed for paying visitors. Interesting. So you're telling me that I could pay money to walk by and see crazy people do crazy things? That almost sounds intriguing. Like, I know it's wrong, but like I almost want to watch, right? It's kind of wild, okay? So reformers pushed for change, and in 1793, Philip Pinel in France removed chains from patients at Beatrice Hospital and promoted moral treatment. We're looking at things like compassion and fresh air and routine and dignity. And William Tuke's York Retreat in England, opened in 1796, applied similar Quaker principles in a small setting designed for about 30 patients. And in the United States, advocates like Dorothea Dix campaigned for state asylums in the 1840s and through the 1850s as human refugees. So early results were often positive, as long as they were in small settings. That's important, small settings. But as these populations grew, driven by urbanization, immigration, and longer lifespans, bringing more dementia cases over the years, and having fewer community alternatives, asylums scaled up dramatically. And what began as therapeutic communities sometimes became large custodial facilities. Overcrowding and understaffing shifted the character from treatment toward management. Where have we seen or heard about that? Overcrowding and understaffing shifted the character from treatment towards management. Maybe the prison system? Yeah. In some urban school districts? Yeah. Okay. All of which are state ran, right? So, well, for the most part, some prisons are individually owned and operated, and actually we're going to do a podcast on that as well, about the prison system and about how some prisons were independently owned, and the whole point of the prison was to make money. And the catch was they used rap from the 1980s to the 1990s to fuel that drive. But we're going to get into that to a different day, okay? So by the mid-20th century, the U.S. state and county hospital population peaked at over 550,000 people in 1955. Into these institutions came a core question that persists. So our question is, who decides who belongs here? And on what evidence? So like, what's the criteria? Okay, which is very important. Once again, we're applying a definition. We're applying criteria to meet certain demands, okay? Or certain structures of that certain system. So the system mechanism. So the structural vulnerability in psychiatric institutions has long been the elastic and administration criteria and the diagnosis power. Unlike criminal law, where charges are defined by statute and trials offer structured rights, right? Psychiatric commitment historically relied heavily on medical judgment, often with family input and limited external review. And we're going to get into a couple of these cases because that's extremely important. So like, once again, who's putting these people behind bars? In these wards, which most of them had bars, like on the doors and the windows. But once again, what's the criteria for putting these people away, basically for the rest of their life, sometimes? So in the 19th century, diagnosis sometimes reflected era-specific social norms. So Samuel A. Cartwright described drapetomia in 1851 as a supposed disorder causing enslaved black people to flee captivity. Right? And dysaesthesia, I'm going to butcher this name, Athiopica, as rascality in free black people. Right? So that's really weird. in and in itself. So these appeared in Southern medical literature, but were widely criticized elsewhere. Well, I wonder why. Gee, let's think. And are now viewed as pseudoscience tied to prevailing racial theories. Masturbation was listed by some physicians as a cause of insanity into the late 1800s. Pretty interesting, right? So commitment practices varied by state, and in some places, including Illinois, wonderful, wonderful state. Like if you love paying taxes, you should move to Illinois. It's a wonderful state. But I digress. So including Illinois, until reforms in the 1860s and 1870s, husbands could initiate commitment of wives with a physician's certificate and minimal judicial oversight, reflecting coverture laws of the time. So if you were a husband and your wife wasn't agreeing with you, we throw her in the psych ward. She's crazy, guys. She's crazy. Right? So let's look at Elizabeth Packard's case in 1860. So a minister's wife in Illinois was committed by her husband after public disagreements on religion and other matters. And so because of this, she spent 3 years in the state hospital. After release, she won a habeas corpus trial where a jury quickly found her perfectly sane. Packard advocated for legal changes, helping secure Illinois' 1867 law requiring jury trials for certain commitments and better patient protections. Her efforts in similar cases highlighted risks when diagnosis substituted for due process. So really, these women didn't really have due process at the time because they were women and because they were married, right? And in the time period, you also have to look in the time period of what was going on. You know, women didn't have a lot of rights in the mid to late 1800s, and in even leading into the early 1900s, in that they couldn't vote. Some of them couldn't own land, depending on what state they were in. So they were very, very limited on the power that they had just to be an individual person in the United States, where we're all supposed to be free. Just let that sink in. Okay. And by the mid-20th century, most U.S. states had added more judicial reviews, though standards still varied from state to state and even from county to county at that point. Okay. So in the Soviet Union, psychiatry was used systematically against political dissidents, a practice known as punitive psychiatry. And so the diagnosis, sluggish schizophrenia, developed by Andrei, and I cannot even pronounce this guy's last name. He's Russian. Okay, we're just going to leave it at that. Had broad criteria that could include dissent, reformist ideas, or conflict with authority, even without clear psychotic symptoms. And so individuals could be hospitalized indefinitely in special psychiatric hospitals without a standard criminal trial. And release depended on perceived remission, often meaning ceasing opposition. So, as long as you agree with me, I'll let you out, right? And so that was their psychiatric charge. Like, think of what's happening today. Like, if you are a Democrat and you don't agree with a Republican, like, they demonize. And the same thing, if you're a Republican and you don't agree with a Democrat, you demonize, right? Same thing was happening here, only they took it so far as to basically ruin these people's lives and throw them in a psychiatric ward for the rest of their life, or unless they admitted that they would never disagree with them ever again, right? That's pretty freaking scary, okay? So just let that sink in for a minute. So documented cases included Red Army General Pyotr, I'm killing these Russian names, I'm not Russian, so, and Vladimir Blavatsky, who smuggled records out, and Natalia, who helped organize the 1968 protest against the invasion of Czechoslovakia. And so the World Psychiatric Association condemned these practices in 1983, where similar mechanisms were reported in Romania. And according to human rights organizations in China's Enkong facilities, for some petitioners or Falun Gong practitioners distributed by the Chinese government as legitimate medical care. So they just make this stuff up on the fly, basically. Like, once again, if you don't agree with what's going on in some of these countries with your political leaders, they would throw you in a psychiatric ward and call it medical care, right, by the government. And so these examples show how alignment between state security and medical institutions can expand diagnosis power beyond just clinical distress into social and even political control. And that's pretty damn scary. Like, that's what we have to watch out for. And so in democratic systems, such explicit coordination has been absent, but the underlying question of diagnosis subjectivity remains. Right? That's where we have to be very careful. We can't cross that threshold. We can't cross that line. Otherwise, like, we're no different than the Russians in the 1960s, and we're no different than what was going on in China during that time as well. Like, and do we want to be labeled as those type of people? Like, we have to take a step back and look at those things, right? And so let's look at the American system. In the U.S., the deinstitutionalization movement of the 1950s through the 1970s and beyond dramatically reduced long-term state hospital populations. Drivers included new antipsychotic medications like chlorpromazine, chlorpromazine, and exposes of conditions, civil rights influences, and cost considerations as well went into this. And so the peak of over 550,000 patients in 1955 fell sharply. Today, psychiatric hospital residence numbers are just under 40,000 nationwide. And so that's a huge difference in 70 years, 70 plus years, 71 years, something like that, right? And so this shift produced mixed outcomes. Many individuals gained greater autonomy. However, community support systems did not always scale adequately in every area. Studies have documented trans-institutionalization with higher shares of people with serious mental illness in places like jails and prisons, right? And those places are already overbooked, overfilled, right? And so homelessness among those with severe untreated illnesses also rose in some periods, though multiple factors including housing costs, substance use, and policy gaps play roles as well. So we can't just blame it all on mental institutions or the breakdown of them, okay? Because there's a lot of other things that was going into this as well. And so recent data show roughly 28 inpatient psychiatric beds per 100,000 population in the U.S., and that was as of 2023. Below many expert recommended benchmarks of 40 to 60 for adequate, acute, and longer-term capacity. So they're saying that we need more beds for some of these institutions. Okay, and once again, we don't want to get to where it's overcrowded. We don't want to get back to where there's hundreds of thousands of mental patients, but look at how society is headed and in the direction that it's headed. Do you think that there is some really whacked out, crazy, just insane people that's living in the United States that probably needs to be locked away? Yeah, I mean, I would say so. Look at all the perversions that are running rampant within our society in today's world, right? That's pretty nasty, okay? There needs to be a place for those people, okay? And so involuntarily commitment laws exist in every state, typically requiring evidence of danger to self or others or a grave disability, like an inability to care for yourself, right? And so standards tightened after key Supreme Court rulings in O'Connor versus Donaldson in 1975. And so the court held that a state cannot constitutionally confine a non-dangerous individual who is capable of surviving safely in freedom with or without help from willing friends or family. That's a long definition, but at least we have a definition that is a little bit better than what was going on in the 1860s, where you could just throw your wife in a mental institution because she didn't believe in the same God, right, as you. Or maybe she just wouldn't cook you supper, and so you had an argument, and let's throw her in a mental institution. How about that? Okay? And so we can also look at Addington versus Texas in 1979 that set a clear and convincing evidence standard for longer-term commitments. So this one was nice in that there has to be credible evidence that this individual deserves to spend the rest of their life in a mental institution and that they cannot take care of themselves and is a danger to the rest of society. And in that case, we throw them in a padded room, okay? And so emergency holds, like a 72-hour hold, they call it the Baker Act in Florida. I think it's called the 5150 in California, can be initiated by law enforcement or medical professionals based on observed crisis. And so basically what they can do is they can hold a person for 72 hours and observe them if, say, like police or a doctor or a nurse thinks that this person is just bat crap crazy, okay? And so in 2014, data covering 24 states, about 52% of the U.S. population, there were roughly 591,000 emergency involuntary detentions, a crude rate of 357 per 1,000 people, with state variations. Okay, and it got as low as like 29 in Connecticut and as high as 966 in Florida at this time. And so longer commitments required court hearings, right? Remember, we have that definition that we provided, and we have to live by that definition. So now we have to have a court proceeding to see if we can move forward with that. And so longer commitment required these court hearings with rights to counsel and periodic review in most jurisdictions. So implementation varies, and disparities in rate, including by race, appear in some studies, and debated as reflecting prevalence differences. Reporting patterns, policing, and other factors kind of went into this as well. Okay? So let's take a look at the diagnostic framework. So the DSM, an acronym, got to have our acronyms, which is the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual of Mental Disorders. This was first published in 1952 by the American Psychiatric Association, and it provides a common reference for diagnosis, research, and the all-inevitable insurance. Yeah, that disgusting word. And so revisions involve task force, literature reviews, and field trials though cultural and professional debates did occur and still do occur. Homosexuality was listed in early editions and was removed in 1973 following the APA board action and a membership referendum, influenced by advocacy and data showing it was not inherently impaired for most. So basically saying that being homosexual doesn't make you a mental head case, which I would agree with that, right? Just because you love somebody that is not the norm in society, like, does that make you mentally crazy? It's not like you're trying to murder somebody or kill somebody or hurt somebody else, right? So it's something we got to think about. And so subsequently, editions have continued to refine categories amid ongoing discussions about boundaries between normal variations, distress, and disorder. And so we have to be very careful in that we know what disorder looks like. We know what distress looks like because we have to define those to know what being normal is, and vice versa. We have to have a definition for what normal is to know what being abnormal is as well. And once again, that's why a definition of the word is very, very important. Okay? And psychiatry has made advances in things like medication, therapies like CBT, and growing evidence of biological and genetic components for many conditions like high hereditary estimates of schizophrenia. And at the same time, critics note incentives in expanding categories, like pharmaceutical influences. So how is Big Pharma influencing this grand scheme, right? And the persistent challenge of subjective judgment in applying diagnosis and confinement decisions. So like, if you're a professional, you have to be very subjective in the judgment because you have the power to potentially lock this person away in a padded room for the rest of your life, right? So if they're white and that physician doesn't like a white person, or if they're black and that physician doesn't like a black person, right? Their judgment is already skewed. And you could apply that to any gender, any ethnicity, any skin color, any religion, right? So subjective judgment is a key component to all of this. And so we have to be, as the medical profession, as humans in that particular job, that's got to be a lot of weight on those people's shoulders, right? We have to make sure that we're picking people and holding those people accountable and making sure that they're being very subjective in their judgment, okay? From the time that they're in to the time that they leave or they're kicked out. And so our conclusion to this is that history traces from early human reforms to large-scale institutions, from moral treatment experiments to documented abuses in authoritarian settings, and from mass institutionalization to de-institutionalization with benefits and unintended consequences on both sides. You're going to have an unintended consequence on both sides, and we've seen both of those, okay? And so psychiatric institutions were created to alleviate real suffering, and involuntary intervention can be life-saving when someone poses imminent danger to themselves or to society or cannot care for themselves. And so modern safeguards, judicial reviews, patients' rights, habeas corpus, and competing providers differ markedly from historical or authoritarian models. So it's just saying that we've made progress, Is there still more progress that can be made down the road? I do think so. I don't think anything is ever perfect, because I think as society changes, all of these institutions, all of these systems should have to change with that society, right? And so the core vulnerability persists wherever diagnosis grants power over liberty. Definitions can shift with knowledge and culture or pressure, and scaling any system tests that system's accountability and the people that's involved in those particular systems. And so data shows both progress, sharply reduced long-term hospitalization, better medications, and ongoing gaps like bed shortages in some areas, or higher involvement in places of like prisons and jails for people that are untreated for their serious illness. And the individuals remembered Elizabeth Packard, Vladimir Bukovsky, and others exposed problems and drove those reforms to happen. And many more lived through these systems. Some helped, some confined under standards, and they later questioned, right? Always got to question things. So the locked ward is rare in open societies today, constrained by law and scrutiny, but the questions endure. How do we protect vulnerable people without enabling overreach? How do we balance individual liberty with public safety and compassion? And the last one, how do we keep diagnostic power from becoming social control? And all of those, I believe, are very, very important questions in making sure that the people that are being locked away deserve to be locked away. And the people that are free deserve to be free. Because that teeter-totter, or whatever you call it, right? Where it can go back and forth, like the weights of humanity, so to speak. You want to make sure you don't have too much of one and not enough of the other, and vice versa, okay? So those are our three critical questions that we're asking you tonight. How do we protect vulnerable people without enabling overreach, whether if it's from an individual institution or even from the government itself? How do we balance individual liberty with public safety and still being compassionate towards the public and towards those individuals? And how do we keep diagnostic power from becoming social control? Like, especially in the United States, we got to watch social control, okay? And so that's the system. You decide what it means with the data that we've given to you and the data that you have in your hand. This was Breaking the System. I hope you guys learned something. I hope you guys ask yourself critical questions. I encourage you. I highly encourage you. I love to read it. Put your comments down below, whether if you agree with me, whether you disagree with me. How did you answer some of those questions? I would love to hear. I would love to read. I would love to see how you're answering some of the critical questions that we're asking. Whether you agree with me or not, I love to hear both sides of the story. That's the whole point of Breaking the System. So with that, God bless. You guys have a good night. We'll see you next time. We appreciate every viewer. Peace.